So if you want to be an innovator, you actually have to go and find ways to break out of that kind of single track your mind might be in. Mm-hmm. I see more of this now than I did earlier in my career. In the real world, when you're really doing disruptive technology and disruptive products and innovating, you're never comfortable.
Welcome to another episode of Oceanside Perspective, Innovators in L.I.T.E series. I'm Alessandro, your host for today, and I have the privilege to be joined by Benjamin Lyon, who is a new member of OP Board of Directors and who's helping build the future of mobility from consumer electronics to autonomous systems to space travel. He currently leads aircraft engineering and development at Archer Aviation after serving as CTO at Aptiv and prior to that, leading engineering at Astrospace, all followed by 2 decades at Apple. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Benjamin, welcome.
Thank you.
So, to start with, I'm very curious about your definition of a disruptor, because I remember you mentioned in some of our previous interviews with Oceanside Perspective that technology is just one ingredient of innovation. Curiosity may be another one, but if you imagine innovation to be a recipe, what would you put inside?
I wish I could find a recipe for innovation. That'd be amazing. Don't have a recipe. Often innovation, you recognize innovation by looking backwards and you go, wow, that thing we did, it really solved the problem and it did it in a really innovative way. But I think I could describe maybe some ingredients or criteria, which would be real disruption creates a shortcut. So real disruption not only changes a process or brings a new capability or a new feature, but it creates a shortcut for humanity. So something that was harder or took longer or was less pleasant is now easier to do, takes less time, is more pleasant. Or some people say, the best feature is the feature that doesn't exist at all. So maybe it removes something that is a pain point altogether.
Yeah. And is there any example drawn from your working experience, which is now more than 25 years probably, across Apple and Astra and now Archer, that truly shows how you contributed to disrupting an industry, whether it's automotive or aircrafts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would actually describe my career, my experience is going from kind of directly doing creative work and design work that is really focused on actually doing a technical design, for example, to actually coaching people and bringing great people together to do the best work of their lives. And so I think the contribution and actually the joy that I've gotten over the years has changed from when I was 19 years old and one of the youngest employees at Apple and, designing, something like, the click wheel for the iPod or a trackpad or a backlit keyboard or something like that, through to, my role, for example, at Archer, where a key piece of it is actually talent. It's actually about understanding what challenges do we face, what is missing, either capability or capacity, and what new kind of mind can I bring into that fold that will create the balance of perspectives that we need, or a unique perspective or unique capability. And when you get to see from where I sit, to see people gel and work together to create something that's more than the sum of their parts, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, say I'm a recent graduate, fresh out of college, and, I applied to Archer, which is the company you're working for right now. What would you look into, I don't know, like a young engineer or like a young employee? What is like that truly makes them stand out?
Sure. Gosh, it's actually not hard. First of all, trust your gut. Whenever you're doing an interview with a candidate, you usually have a gut feeling, a non-technical thing. It's actually very much, an intuitive thing that tells you right away, okay, this person's interesting. And what are things that where you can put a word to it? One is curiosity. When you talk to a candidate and it's very clear that they're interested in why something is, not just kind of, telling you facts, but they're interested in the why behind those things, that's key. But another one, and I think this is one that people of all generations often struggle with, is how people behave when they're at the limits of what they know. So when you don't know the answer to the interview question, what do you do? And so part of what we do at Archer when we structure interviews is we ensure that we take people through the areas where they're comfortable and take them out of their comfort zone and see how they respond. Because in the real world, when you're really doing disruptive technology and disruptive products and innovating, you're never comfortable. And it's important to be able to be your best when you are in that area of kind of maximum vulnerability, maximum discomfort, because you are literally laying the new train track.
Yeah. And did you ever see maybe across your entire career, because at first, you were 19 when you joined Apple?
Yeah.
That's very young.
Just turned 19.
Wow. I'm 22. I feel like an uncle right now. But did you ever see either like yourself or some employee, some colleague that was from a younger generation contributing like with their unique perspective, like their unique, maybe like generational perspective, and maybe, I don't know, maybe clashing against some older members of the team? Did it ever happen to you?
Not so much at Apple. Apple was very much a meritocracy, and Steve made it that way. As a matter of fact, Steve would hold lunch, what we call like a brown bag lunch, every couple of weeks with us kids, effectively, at Apple, just to get his sense, to help calibrate himself around what is the next generation of users of technology thinking about. And we would discuss things like a one-button mouse versus a multi-button mouse. Those of us who did online gaming, for example, the idea of like a one-button mouse, like how are you going to right-click or use a scroll? And Steve would be like, yeah, but do you think your grandma's going to be confused by all these buttons on a mouse? So like, where's the solution? That's actually how we came up with the whole multi-touch mouse idea, where you could get kind of the both functionalities, but meet the needs of, a broad spectrum of customers. I think places where I've come across more of the generational divide, I would say, is, when I started my career, it was common for people to spend 20 years in a job at one company. And that had a real value, because it's kind of like your ability to be strategic requires you to be able to take the long view.
Yeah.
And so then things evolved, especially in software, where it became much more common for people to spend maybe 2 years at a company. Mm-hmm. And they would often finish that software release, for example, deliver that new feature, and then move on to either a different team or a different company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you spent almost 22 years at Apple, if I'm not wrong, which is a long time.
Yeah.
And maybe you can tell our audience, what are the reasons that made you quit after that much time spent at a company, and what were you looking for after Apple? Were you looking like, I'm very curious, because, my peers who currently work at big tech companies lamented feeling like sometimes like a cog inside like this huge machine.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious about like what it was like, at your time.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things. The first is I've never quit a company in my career,
Wow.
including Apple. I've always been drawn to something else, and I had to weigh the balance of keep doing the thing I'm enjoying doing, or and possibly regret later not having explored an opportunity that
Sure.
arrived. And so, for example, I was, at Apple doing some really cool robotics and AI stuff, and the opportunity to go learn about rockets came, and I just thought, what happens if 50 years from now, or I don't know, however much time I have left, right, in my life, I'm like looking at my grandchildren going, I had a chance to try to launch rockets into orbit, and I just passed that up because, I was busy being comfortable and enjoying being comfortable.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to disrupt yourself, and that's been kind of the path for me. You asked another really interesting question, but I forgot the other half of your question.
I asked like first what made you quit, and you what made you be drawn to other opportunities,
Yeah.
and the feeling
cog.
of being a cog inside a very big company.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting one because I see more of this now than I did earlier in my career and in the middle of my career. And so it's actually a really important thing to understand. And I don't fully understand it. What I can tell you is a couple of things. The first is, when I joined Apple, Apple was in trouble. And there was a group of folks led by Steve who were on a journey to bring Apple back, starting with the iMac and then rolling eventually into iPod and then into iPhone, iPad, Watch, et cetera, and all of its services and content. Now Apple's in a very, very amazing place, right? And it's in a position where it can do some amazing work in the world. But it wasn't like that in 1999. The campus was almost empty. And we actually had other companies leasing space inside the campus in order to be able to make sure that, we could keep going. And so actually where I was, literally I would walk past my work area and there wasn't even a wall because we couldn't afford to put a wall in place. And then we're now into another company that's leasing space at Apple. And of course that changed over time as Apple, came back. But the funny thing is that from the first day at Apple, I always felt that what I was doing mattered. And part of that came from the adversity. It came from the fact that we knew that if we didn't do great work and we didn't ship products that, or flip it around, if we had to go find a way to ship a product we were truly proud of, or we were done. And so that creates, on one hand, a lot of stress.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Tremendous amount of stress. But a real feeling of purpose and being part of a team to go save Apple. And then, of course I grew up with the company, and so I never felt personally like a cog.
Sure.
Or, even though we grew to being over 160,000 people and we became a very global team. So I never had that personal experience. However, I know people who have had that experience in many companies, and it makes me really curious about, to start out with, given that I know people who feel that way both in small companies and in big companies. What about our current culture as a society causes that? Because I think it's more than just the actual companies they're at. I think there's something in society where I think we're very fortunate. Our great-grandparents, many of our great-grandparents never got to go to college. Many of our great grandparents had to deal with world wars,
Yeah.
right? Many of them, they didn't get to worry about all of these kind of existential purpose in the world things because they were focused on, how do I feed my family? How do I make the next generation have opportunities I never had? And now there's this incredible opportunity, which is for many folks, not everyone in the world, but certainly in Silicon Valley, there's these opportunities. And yet there's anxiety and there's that feeling of being a cog. I think that's where work like what you're doing and universities and schools really have a place to play to kind of trigger that creative spark.
Yeah. Yeah. Like this, I've never felt this way, I would say, just because I think, first of all, it depends on the type of person you are, because if you're not used to expose yourself to, or like, seek something new, and that like brings back the matter of being constantly curious and just like, trying things out. But if you're someone like who tends to just abide by the rules and like, just conform with what is told to you, then you would probably be like more likely to feel like this little piece of like a big machine. But the other thing I would say is that and it's very, very important for like literally anybody, not only in in tech startups but I would say in any kind of field, to have this entrepreneurial mindset, by which I mean being able to take initiatives for yourself and finding, for sure, like if I'm not, if I have a work that doesn't spark my passion, or like doesn't relate at all, I'm thinking about insurance probably, it's harder, right, to bring my value to the table and not feeling like alienated inside, right? But I'm very passionate about climate change. I'm very passionate about education, and I know that many employees, young employees right now, and not only young, I think also my parents' generation, would benefit from hearing that if it's meant to be, it's largely up to them, and
Yeah, it's what you make it.
Yeah.
I also think that's right. I also think that there's a real opportunity for how we educate the next generation, to make sure that even though the world now is full of products that are quite refined in a way they weren't refined 2 decades ago, and runs at a pace because of the level of connectivity that is much faster than it ran even 2 decades ago, to make sure that folks understand that it doesn't have to be perfect. Nothing has to be perfect. And don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, because if it doesn't have to be perfect, I think that's actually part of it. Is I think, every generation is so much brighter than the previous one, and like I find myself incredibly impressed. I have 2 daughters, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like I wasn't nearly as deep a thinker as they were when I was their age, and I just go like, it's mind-blowing. It's really, really cool. However, in order for them to be successful, they have to be brave. And I notice how perfectionistic they are. Yeah. Because they see their parents, they see, dad successful, mom successful, I've got to be successful. And it's like, well, but I didn't get successful by, starting out magically successful. I made many, 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 many mistakes and learned a ton. And the trick is to make mistakes that you can learn from and keep moving forward. And that's where having a team is really helpful, because you can watch each other's backs and help each other catch the really, really challenging mistakes that could be existential for your team. Whatever your team is, doesn't even have to be a company. And that's actually the other piece of it, which is for anybody feeling like they're a cog, I would challenge them to figure out, how can you feel like you're part of a team that's more than the sum of its parts? How can you find inspiration in the people you work with? And if you can't, maybe you can inspire them.
Yeah. I'm also thinking that this feeling that our generation has to, be always like the best version of themselves, to always like strive for perfectionism, hinders learning in very subtle ways. I personally started taking risks in my life when I left home, because I felt that when I was at home, probably like I internalized all these beliefs, but it was my job to be like academically performing, to just like walk the path that was kind of some sort of like predetermined. It was never imposed by my parents, but I felt this I internalized this duty. But when I moved abroad, I first moved to France 2 years, then here in the US, and I'm about to go back home for Christmas finally. But I started noticing how relative that like that reality was. Like, it's not necessarily like that. I can actually do this and this. I can take different paths, and I think that's a super important realization, especially for students who are like very, very academically focused, or like employees that are kind of like that think they are trapped in that reality, to probably question it and like to think that you can make it different, and for sure though, like, it's also, we need to acknowledge that the risks that you can take at my age, or like in your 20s, or when you're at university, are probably different from the ones that you can take when you have a family to support, or like...
Yeah, I think that's true. I think also one of the things I would suggest to any young person or younger person who can afford to travel, because not everybody can, is go travel. And don't go travel tourism. Go travel and actually like spend time with people and families that live in other places, have other cultures than your own. Because you're internationally traveled. I'm sure you've seen some very different, very, very different things. And there's beauty in each of those cultures. There's actually really interesting things to learn. You don't have to agree with everything. You can just experience, you can just learn, and by seeing those differences, you can pick out the things you really admire and go, okay, I'm going to learn from that. I'm going to incorporate that into who I am, how I work, and I think it's also helps us appreciate what we have, because very much not everybody has what some us in Silicon Valley have.
Right now I'm living between San Francisco and San Diego, and let's say that I thought, like, before coming to San Francisco, I thought that like I was a very hard worker, but like seeing the work ethic there, it literally let's say that I picked it up. Like I realized that it's something that I want to incorporate. Or maybe the sense of respect from Asian culture, like the sense of like maybe privacy and like maybe filial piety. Those things are that I came to learn throughout my journey internationally are some things that I really, really appreciate.
I'll tell you a crazy story. So my wife's a ballerina.
Wow.
And she's largely retired now, but she was a pretty big time ballerina once upon a time. And she grew up in a village in the Himalayan foothills in the far southwest of China.
Wow.
And so her extended family all pulled their income together, cut it in half. And that's what they sent with with my wife to Beijing, where she studied at the National Ballet School. And she had the scholarship to the school, but she still had to eat, and she still needed clothing and, ballet shoes and whatnot. And in the capital of the country, it's much, much more expensive than out in a village. And so the whole family called that time period their tightening of the belts time, because they tightened their belts so this one kid could go, be a ballerina. And when she finally made it and was successful and was able to start supporting the broader family back at home with her income from being a very successful ballerina, that was more important to her actually than anything else.
Yeah.
When I ask her and see her eyes light up, what is she most proud of? It's the fact that she was able to give back to all these folks who sacrificed in order for her to be able to be successful. And of course, my kids growing up in Silicon Valley, where they have, everything that we know how to bring to them.
Yeah.
Right. That doesn't mean that they have everything. It's just they have everything we know how to bring them that we can think of. They don't have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so figuring out how we can create experiences, at work, in education, in how we raise our children, et cetera, so kind of multi-generational, to see each other's perspectives, see how we can help each other out, and then show gratitude. I think it's super powerful. It's super, super powerful. And for me personally, I look back at 22 years at Apple and the good fortune I've had to work with great teams and with great people. I'm super thankful for that. And I think the appreciation helps with curiosity, helps with innovation. It helps with all of those things. So it's taking a moment to see how other people live and what they care about. Just helps you break out of the track of your own existing idea set. It gets rid of the echo chamber.
Yeah.
And so if you want to be an innovator, you actually have to go and find ways to break out of that kind of single track your mind might be in.
Mm-hmm. Get exposed to as many shocks as you can, I would say.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I lived with, straight out of high school, I lived the first year with this Latvian roommate of mine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a bit eccentric, but I love her and learned so much from all of her Soviet culture.
Mm-hmm.
Then I spent 6 months with 2 Indian girls, lived with just Chinese kids here in the U.S. So it's been a journey, and for sure it opened my mind, and I can see the difference right now when I talk with my friends back at home.
Yeah.
Who haven't had the privilege, because it's a privilege, to make all these experiences.
So I'm curious. So you just described multiple different folks that you've spent real time with from different cultures. What is the single most unifying common characteristic? And we talked about differences. What's one of the most unifying common characteristics that you've observed?
I would say across cultures, lots of aspects might differ, but common denominators that are tied to human nature remain the same. And I would say the need and desire for deep human connection, to have someone you love, to have some sort of sense of belonging to a community or a family. Then also, the need to be able to sustain yourself and to be safe, security, shelter. These are very, very basic things, but they're common across all cultures. And then I would say a sense of fulfillment and achievement in what you do, whatever the field might be.
Yeah.
But being able to, and this is oftentimes tied to your self-worth and the recognition from others. This is also something important because I do believe humans are like social animals, a very social species. We thrive through collaboration. We're like our evolutionary journey is one of like cooperating and like all the reality that we live in is not like the product or like the outcome of a single person. It's
Sure.
like society at large. So I would say like the desire to be recognized also for what you do, and we're everybody is like involuntarily like is socialized into the culture, like the environment they live in. And so I would say, I don't know, question, do you think that the environment you live in, and the people you surround yourself with, kind of trump or override will?
I don't know about overriding will. I think we all get to make choices. And I know when I look back on choices that I've made, I almost look at it as like I'm filling two buckets. One bucket is like of good choices. One bucket is of choices that if I could revisit, maybe I would do them a little differently.
Sure.
And my hope is that the bucket of the like choices I'm proud of grows faster than the other bucket. But you never know. But I think your question around environment is a very valid one. And that's why I think it's so important, especially in this day and age, for individuals of all ages to seek out perspectives that aren't ones they already have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that doesn't mean they have to accept or agree with those perspectives. So it's one thing to say, I'm going to seek out perspectives that are not the same as mine, and I'm going to adopt them. It's another thing to say, hey, I'm going to seek out these perspectives. I'm going to learn from them. Because learning means that you still have will. You still can decide what characteristics am I going to pick up
Yeah.
from that and whatnot. But yes, environment is super important. That said, again, from having raised two kids in a very similar environment who are very similar in some ways and very, very different in other ways, I can tell you as a parent that there's definitely an aspect that has nothing to do with environment that has personality, right?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm thinking though that maybe Gen Z and like Gen Alpha is at a serious risk with like strong social media consumption of having too much of a confirmation bias of their perspectives and beliefs in their lives. And so I would want to ask you, what do you think Gen Z, like anybody like my age should do to seek out, like, intentionally seek out a diversity of perspectives and not fall in the trap of, okay, this, like, the algorithm, my feed just like confirms what I think, and it's like just supposed to provide pleasure or like.
Yeah. I mean, for one, seek out real people in real life.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds very cliche, but there are lots of opportunities for that. You can go to school, right? And you run into your classmates. I think the second is, and this is actually one for, maybe the kind of the older generation, which is the online experience is part of, at least in our culture, the human experience. So you can't say get offline, disconnect, don't be online.
Sure.
That's not real. It is. And the social network, which used to be purely in person and then became in person and then telephone, or really in person and then telegraph, right? Or mail, right? I guess you could say in person, then mail, then telegraph, then radio, then TV, now the internet, video conferencing. now social media, these are all real. They're real parts of the human experience. Now, that doesn't mean we have to become slaves to it. That would be bad. But they are real, and so it's important in the intergenerational dialogue that, on one hand, the generation that grew up before the internet should have curiosity about what the experience is to live live deeply in a world that has a significant element that's online. The flip side is that similarly, the Generation Alpha that spends a lot of their experience online should develop some of the resiliency that I see in the generation that grew up without the internet.
Yeah.
To, okay, somebody says something that is unkind to me on the internet, or describes something I did in a way that I didn't like, or has a perspective that I don't agree with. Okay. Right.
I'll deal with it.
All right. And so I think both those things are true. And that's the beauty of it. Both those things can be true. And I think that I was speaking with a friend of mine who's a journalist, and she was saying that one of the things that is very different today is that cultural change happens at the rate of cultural exchange. And what social media has done is it has completely connected the world globally in a way that it was not before, and at least at a pace it was not before. And so one of the things as like a leader in a company, as a parent of kids, that I have to keep in mind myself is that rate of cultural change has gone up, at least for the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so while my kids don't have to deal with adapting to, World War or the ability to eat, they do have to deal with adapting to the constant
change.
flow, constant change in the digital.
Hi, Oceanside Perspective community. Here we are today with the Oceanside Perspective founder and CEO, Helen Wang. Helen, can you tell us a little bit about OP for the viewers that are new or who may not even know what OP is about?
Yeah, so Oceanside Perspective, I would say, well, first of all, we are content creator for the purpose of education. And we are a nonprofit, so we really care about our mission and impact. What is our mission? We have a tagline called Light Beyond Generation. So hopefully that people who are really interested to learn more about the leadership, innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship, which is a short LITE, and across generations.
Let's focus down on the innovation topic.
Yeah.
I know, I learned about Clayton Christensen's Innovators Dilemma, where basically the main argument is that big successful companies focus on what made them successful, and this might blind them to actually the disruptions that then kind of like take them down in some way. And so as far as I understand, in the Innovator's Dilemma is a choice of allocating resources, allocating capital, allocating time.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in your career, how did you see, maybe at Apple or now at Archer, how did you see this parallel allocation of what is working, so sustaining innovation, and disrupting innovation, so experimenting or taking risks?
Well, there are a couple of things to realize. The first is that the skill set required to do disruption is very different than the skill set required to scale and maximize an opportunity that has been developed. And I like to call it builders versus polishers. And they're both very important. You need to be able to do the initial building, but then you also need to be able to do the polishing. Take a product from, think of it as a diamond in the rough or an MVP, a minimum viable product, to something that really has reached its full potential. And that takes lots of polishing and a lot of attention to detail. However, folks who are really amazing at polishing, they often really struggle to build something from nothing. And people who are really great builders often get bored or frustrated or don't have the attention to detail in order to do the polishing. And so you often see a company start with builders, and then the builders get driven out, and then it gets run by the polishers. And then once you run the full curve of the product, and now you're ready to come up with something new, disrupt, but you actually don't have the muscles for disruption anymore.
Yeah. So
one analogy I like to think of is that the polishers pay for the builders. So, instead of being in a mode where you build and then you polish, how about you're always building and you're always polishing? And that's kind of like where mine's at. And if you look at Apple has an incredible history of disrupting itself over and over again and making the hard choices to do that. And then if you zoom away from Apple for a minute and you look at an example of where you can get into that innovator's dilemma, multiple companies in tech were all working on large language models. And OpenAI came along and went, yeah, it's not perfect. That's okay. We're going to go release a product.
Yeah.
And look at the impact, right? And of course, things have followed on with Gemini and Anthropic and Copilot, et cetera, But the disruption came from OpenAI, while many tech companies were holding back releasing anything because it wasn't perfect. Maybe it'll be better, good enough in 5 years. Maybe it'll be good enough in 10 years. And so it's back to that, what is proper disruption? It's when you make a change that creates a shortcut. And ChatGPT created a phenomenal shortcut, right? It gave people quick access to information, quick access to answers to questions that they had. At Archer, one of the things that's really interesting is Archer, of course, is a company that one of the things it's doing is hardware, right? The Midnight aircraft is hardware, but it's a big hardware that's actually run by software. And so we absolutely use AI to improve the rigor, depth, quality, and automate the tasks that are boring, that are kind of repetitive. And then we use people for the real creative stuff and for the extra oversight. So think of it as using AI as superpowers.
So I'm curious though, I guess hardware is like the speed at which hardware can be like iterated is probably like slower than software, way
Correct.
Slower. So how do you make sure that you maintain both speed and quality when, because I guess it's also like, especially for like, aircrafts must be secure. It's like, it's a make or break.
Must be safe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So hardware and software do iterate at different speeds. At the end of the day, no matter how fast you are with your ideas, you can only cut metal and have it have a certain characteristic at a certain speed. So if it's a big tool that you're cutting out of metal, for example, that tool may take a year to cut. So like if you're cutting a tool for a car, for example, it may take a year to cut that tool. And in software, you can iterate sometimes multiple times a day.
Yeah.
Now that said, when you're doing an aviation product or an autonomous car project, or something that has a mission critical, safety critical element to it, you have to develop a tool chain that guarantees that the software is going to work every time and all the time. And when you are running both a software team and a hardware team on the same integrated program, you actually have to manage them differently because the software has to be able to iterate quickly. The hardware has to be able to iterate more slowly because of the cost. If you get it wrong on, let's say, that tool that takes a year to build, or that silicon that takes
You're going bankrupt.
It can be a big deal, right? At the very worst case, you lost a lot of time. In the best case, you lost a lot of time. In the worst case, maybe it's existential for your company. However, because it's a hardware software product, they do have to synchronize. They do have to come back together. And software culture, as a result, is very different than hardware culture. And so it's about merging those cultures together and finding the right synchronization points where you run a fast loop here, you run a slower loop here, but it's kind of like rubbing your belly and patting your head. There's a moment where it all comes together, almost like a beat, like rhythm and
really
music.
like this analogy.
Yeah. So that's what I do. And when it works, it's amazing. When it doesn't work, it can be really, really challenging. But often that's where the opportunities for innovation come.
Yeah.
Is where it's not working.
Yeah. And like building upon this, I'm curious, when do you realize whether to like abandon a like disruptive project or like an experiment? Because, it may fail at the first times. And was there any point in your experience, maybe I'm thinking at Apple for sure, where you saw like the company choosing to do maybe like to stop some kind of like experiments because like they failed too many times, and just
Sure. I've had multiple kinds of experiences that have both been things that we thought we abandoned and then brought them back later.
Okay.
For example, actually, and I wasn't around at Apple for the Apple Newton, but the Apple Newton's a great example of something that was really, really cool, but the necessary technologies to support it didn't exist at the time. So
what is the Apple Newton?
See? At least you didn't ask me what an iPod was. I had an employee in my company ask me what an iPod was. And because I was talking about it, she thought it was iPod Touch. I'm like, no, a little thing with a wheel on it that spins. And she looked at me like I was crazy. So the Newton was a tablet computer that, you look at the iPad and you go, the Newton eventually evolved to the iPad. But yeah, the Newton was a tablet product that Apple launched. It didn't succeed. It was very expensive, and it needed the internet to be way better. It needed 3G, 4G, something like that in order to really bring the power.
Mm-hmm.
And without the kind of ubiquitous wireless connectivity, the Newton wasn't going to be able to shine. And battery technology in order to get the battery life up, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that's amazing is the idea of a tablet was a really important idea. And even though the Newton was canned, fast forward a number of years later, and out comes the iPad, and it was a tremendously successful product, is a tremendously successful product. So that's a good example. Another, which is something that never even made it to being a product, is the first prototype of the iPhone did not look like an iPhone. It looked a lot more like an iPod, and of course, you make hundreds in a company like Apple, you make hundreds and hundreds of prototypes. The trick is an idea needs to be protected at the beginning, because otherwise, remember, we have polishers as well as builders, right? You'll just stamp out those ideas if you don't protect them. But you have to only protect them long enough that they can grow into seedlings, and you can decide, is this a plant I want in my garden or is it a weed?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to protect it to the point where it can grow enough that you can tell, where is it going?
Sure.
Is it going anywhere, right? And then the discipline of going and saying, okay, 1,000 no's for one yes is a discipline, but it allows for focus, and it allows for making that challenging, disruptive innovation successful.
And I'm thinking though that you need like some sort of different criteria, like different KPIs to measure the success or failure, or like the condition of like this initial like experimentations, like to be able to and I don't know what do you think like
honestly,
They are.
you're going to hate this because it's just so simple and it doesn't sound very thoughtful, but I think it's honestly true, which is, would I want it?
Yeah.
Like, it's that simple. I think we sometimes really overcomplicate things.
We do.
And like, the ChatGPT is a great example. Anybody who picked up ChatGPT when it came out was like, oh, this is cool. This is awesome. Hey, and next thing you know, you're going to tell a friend, hey, did you see this thing? I was able to put in like, what should my itinerary be if I'm visiting L.A.? Like, what are cool places to see in L.A.? Now I've got a vacation plan, or,
Yeah.
how high can the average human jump? If because like my kids use GPT not for like engineering, they use GPT.
Of course. I remember I used it like to generate like a kind of like a trap song, like the first one.
Yeah.
Like
That's exactly right.
yeah, it was very cool. Like yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. So I make watches as a hobby.
Wow.
And so I'm using machines, in my garage to cut metal and glass and plastic and things like that. I'm using GPT all the time to tell me how to set my machines up so that it works. Like, how fast should the, cutter spin, all that kind of stuff. Somebody else is using GPT. Like my wife uses GPT to check her emails in order to make sure that they sound, they're proper English, because English is not her first language.
Yeah.
So, like, all you have to do is have a diverse set of people and go, what do you think? And if they're like, oh, yeah, this is cool, I want this. Well, that probably is something that should keep going. Now, it can be really challenging with certain projects that to get it where they need to go may go far beyond the resources of your company.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to figure out, can I partner to make this thing happen?
Sure.
If I can't, can I get past the idea along to someone else or some other company that may have the capability to actually take it where it needs to go? Or is this something so big that it needs, public institutions to make this idea happen, either in university or, something even broader. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, you have to both look at what is the technology horizon for a thing. So, for example, if you create a great user experience, but it requires a building's worth of technology in order to make that user experience work, well, you're going to have to wait until all those technologies mature enough.
Yeah.
I mean, a great example of that is AR, VR, right? Where there is a future somewhere with, wearable computing that is going to create amazing experiences. And you can see those experiences in movies. You can try them on,
Sure.
at events. But the reality is that the actual products today are heavy. They have low battery life. They make you feel sick after a while, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, but that's because of where we are today. In order to develop that kind of tech, though, requires the capabilities of companies that can run a marathon, not run a sprint. So when choosing what projects to carry forward and what projects to not carry forward, you do have to think practically about what can you actually reach the end on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, maybe with the aircraft, like in the aircraft space, I'm curious, like how do you know, or like how did you gather data that suggests like that, like people actually are willing to take like this, like sort of air taxes, as far as I understand. And
Yeah.
have you already tried like testing with customers, or?
Well, remember, I'm not a helicopter pilot. I'm learning to be a helicopter pilot. I'm a commercial fixed-wing pilot. So I already have the experience of being able to skip the traffic and make a trip that would have been 3.5 hours in like 35 minutes.
That's crazy.
And it makes a huge difference. The problem is that's expensive. And, part of the issue with modern helicopters is, the affordable ones have one engine and they're loud, right? It's an engine.
Yeah.
And so you piss off people in the city, plus people worry about safety because only one engine.
Mm-hmm.
And so Archer looked at that and went, okay, how do we make something that is fundamentally cheaper, safer, and less polluting? You know,
Sure.
both lower carbon as well as noise pollution. And that's how we came up with our aircraft. So it has 6 batteries in it,
Wow.
12 propellers. It has a wing,
Okay.
so it can take off like a helicopter, but
Yeah,
it can
it
fly
takes
like
off
an
vertically.
airplane. Yeah. So and as we talked about, it's super quiet, and so the additional redundancy and safety that comes with the multiple powertrains, multiple batteries, multiple computers, and still with a pilot in charge, though obviously in the future you can imagine stuff in the future. I think it breaks a lot of the barriers. And then for people who need to get from one side of LA to the other side of LA, it's now much quieter, safer, and faster. And then the last piece, which is I think important, is that the electric powertrain allows you to have a system that's much, much lower maintenance. Think about electric cars and how much less maintenance electric cars are versus combustion engine vehicles. Sure. The same thing is true in anything that uses a powertrain. So moving to electric really, really helps with the maintenance and therefore the cost per ride.
Yeah. But as with any sort of innovation that requires a public-private partnership, I imagine there are like a lot of, maybe like, struggles coordinating with public institutions, with the FAA.
Yeah, we work with the FAA. We have to work with also local government as well. And we have to work with international folks like GCAA and the like. So we have to work with everybody. And
that slows things down, doesn't it?
That's one way to look at it, but I'll flip it around on you, which is the other way to look at it is by having these diverse perspectives and folks who have, a very focused set of priorities. The FAA, their goal is to get people from point A to point B as safely as absolutely possible. And by bringing those perspectives in the room, you actually develop the best products. By collaborating with folks who don't just have your perspective, you actually are made to be better. So yes, it can be frustrating at times when the government gets shut down. Of course it can be frustrating. You lose the people you get to talk with for a while until that gets resolved and things like that. But overall, I think that the collaboration between, FAA, air traffic control, NASA, the various different regulating bodies, and then the companies doing the innovation on the other side, creating the products. I think that is exactly the kind of discourse that we need.
Yeah, it's like, I would say it's the way to truly create like innovation in society, like engaging all stakeholders.
Yeah, I think folks look at the iPhone, for example, and they think, well, that's all Apple. It's only Apple. Well, yes, Apple did an incredible amount of work on the iPhone. The iPhone worked on wireless networks because Apple partnered with wireless carriers who are not nearly tech companies the way you would imagine a tech company. They are tech companies, but not in the same way. They're really tech infrastructure companies. And that was an incredible partnership. And without having the wireless network, it's kind of like the Newton story, right?
Yeah.
Without the wireless network, what's the iPhone or the iPad or the Google Pixel or, name your pick. So that's the kind of a thing to remember. And actually, this is a generational thing that I think is important, which is I think when we look to the future, I think a culture of collaboration especially with people who don't look like us, talk like us, think like us, is going to make us the more adaptable,
Yeah.
survivable, and hopefully thriving, humanity of the future.
So let's root for win-win always,
Yeah,
and
win-win.
collaboration.
Why not?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I have picked up this card and it says, what do you generally tend to avoid in your life?
I think like my grandma. Just like, I love her, but like if you see like my story, just I moved abroad as soon as I could.
Yeah.
And I haven't, and that's actually very cool, because every single time I return to Italy, it's like, the Pope has come back. So like,
Uh-huh.
I love my grandma, but I wouldn't spend too much time there. That's maybe like, a generational clash, but
Uh-huh.
the topics are, I guess, the same old stories that I practically memorized.
Yeah.
I don't know. What about you? What do you tend to avoid?
I was going to say like food, because whenever I'm around food, I eat way too much of it. So I try to avoid food as much as possible so that, when I'm around it, I can eat it. But I like yours way better.
Avoid my grandma. I love you, grandma.
Now, this says on it below, it says flaws, fears, and regrets. This is such a deep card. This is like the most deep card I've ever seen. I think it can go back into the deep deck.
Yeah.
And there it goes.
Yeah. Can I pick one?
Yeah, go for it.
Pass. Okay. Well, we'll pass it.
Pass.
Yeah.
You could just pick up the card and make up whatever's on it, and I would never know.
Wow. That's a deep question too.
Okay.
What do you feel vulnerable about?
What do I feel vulnerable about? I don't know. I'm always learning something new. So usually I feel really vulnerable about whatever it is I'm really passionate about and learning at the time. So it could be like right now I'm learning how to fly a helicopter, but I'm like very early in that experience. So I'm being protected a lot by my instructor.
Yeah.
And so that feeling of trying to fly something that's inherently unstable without crashing, that constant feeling of you're on the verge of being out of control of a machine that's flying, it's definitely an experience. And but the flip side is you feel appreciation when you feel vulnerability, because having an amazing instructor, for example, who's keeping you safe and allowing you to learn, that's the flip side, and that's true for it's true for anything.
Yeah. I'm thinking that, maybe the aspect where I'm most vulnerable is sort of similar, because and it's when I'm trying to learn something that I haven't gained expertise in, and for me, I don't have much of a technical background, so to talk with you, I did some kind of preparation, just trying to learn what an autonomous system is, or all this terminology that I'm not acquainted with, and it seems daunting at first. There's a little voice in my head saying, you're kind of like, whoa, that's risky, you don't know the stuff. It's not your area of expertise, but at the same time, once you gain that knowledge, you start becoming very appreciative. Yeah.
You want to hear a little grandma story?
Yeah, sure.
Since you kicked this off talking about grandmothers?
Of course.
So my grandmother on my mom's side, she graduated from Caltech and she taught in university. And she would teach things like molecular biology, chemistry, stuff like that. And so I was thinking about, your insecurity around or vulnerability around learning new technical things. She would go into her lectures at the beginning of the semester and she would start with, well, only about 20% of what I'm about to teach you will still be true 50 years from now. But I don't know which 20%, so pay attention. So, if you're a little nervous about your technical capability, Just realize it's all going to change, and
Yeah.
you know, give it in with enough time.
Yeah, yeah, and also I would say that like it would be kind of dumb not to feel vulnerable, or at least like in some sort of precarity, especially right now.
Yeah.
Because like things are moving so fast that it literally seems to me as if, you know, every single day that passes, like the gap, the intergenerational gap between like, you know, me and my parents or my grandma, like disproportionately widens. And so I would say that like it's also maybe a good thing to feel vulnerable, because like it pushes you to, you know, keep up the pace and stay updated maybe.
Well, it definitely drives learning, right? It drives adapting, it drives learning. And I mean, species' ability to adapt is what makes a species not just survive, but thrive and succeed. I'm curious though, when you think about like your experience with folks who are, you know, my generation or your grandparents, what are like the top things that you think of are like feel really different to you, and what are things that kind of feel similar? I'm just like, if you just kind of think of those two buckets.
Mm-hmm. So I would say I want to start with the differences, because they're so like they're on top of my head and they're so evident for me. The first thing is I've rarely seen like people from older generation, especially like as they as people grow older, to you know, maintain this same level of hunger and curiosity to learn. Maybe there's some physiological explanation for that, you know, neuroplasticity just, you know, becomes less and less, and it's more, it requires more effort to learn new things and like to change behavior, because at the end of the day, there's like, you know, when you question the way your grandma does something or your dad does something, and like they tend not to be very, very receptive of those suggestions. Like it's very hard for them to change. It's hard for everybody to change behavior, I would say, but especially, you know, for maybe like older people. So the first thing is, in general, like the tendency to diminish or to stop learning, which is like my belief is that when you stop learning, or you refuse to keep learning, then you start slowly dying inside, because there's like either you grow or like you shrink. And it's also like, you know, I went to this for San Francisco Tech Week. I went to this neurotech event, and they were showing like brain scans of like people from different ages, and they showed how like the like brains actually shrank. That was very interesting. The second big difference that I would say is that, you know, our definition, like our younger generation's definition of success, includes way more this kind of like narrative and rhetoric of purpose, of a mission. You should have like a passion and follow that and make that your, you know, your living, basically your source of sustaining yourself. While I don't know, when I think of how my parents or grandparents perceive their job, they just think of it as like, you know, as a source of income, as, you know, the 9 to 5. You go there, you do your job, and you get a living out of that. And I'm not sure it resonates that much with our generations, or maybe my perspective is biased because I've met mostly, you know, like young entrepreneurs, young founders who are very passionate about what they're doing. And especially in general, I've met throughout my life. I did an Italian public high school in what I like to say the parking lot of Venice, the other side of the bridge. Literally, it's like where tourists like stay.
Don't go.
Yeah. And I did an Italian public high school, studied mostly Latin and ancient Greek, which is very beautiful, but also like kind of useless. It was a choice made at 13. And then I went to France, to one of like of the top political science schools in the world, and there I just like came to know lots of like peers that are passionate about, for example, education or climate change, or like the big crisis of our times. So I would say that another difference is this heightened awareness of what's going on, or like this, sensitivity to these big causes that like might provoke two different reactions, I would say. One is like being empowered and being hungry to find a solution to that, and I would like identify myself in that bucket, or a sense of being powerless, or like
Yeah, it's so
being
interesting.
doomed to. And I would love to know also, like your work at Archer. I'm very curious to know what, like, if, it's an electric, like the eVTOL, like are
Yeah.
basically like electric vehicles, right? Like, do you think that this is a cool, like a big step forward?
It's a huge step forward. So in my life, I've had a few moments where, I was experiencing a moment and realizing the world's changed and I know it. The rest of the world doesn't know it, and I know it. And one of those was actually with the first iPhone, where me and just a few other people are sitting in a lab actually in the middle of China, in a factory, and we're bringing up the very, very first working iPhone prototype. And when the display finally got working and we were able to manipulate the display and multi-touch and have a configurable user interface where the user interface changed depending on what you were doing on it, we were sitting there and we realized, wow, like we have something here and it's different and it's going to change the world. It put the internet in people's pockets, and we knew it, but it was not just months; it was over a year before the rest of the world, would see it and know that, and that's a pretty interesting feeling. Second time I had that feeling was Archer's first piloted test flight, and because the vehicle is completely electric. The aircraft was flying just tens of feet over the runway as it flew past us, and we're on the ramp at the airport, inside the airport. And we could whisper to each other. We were literally whispering.
And you could hear yourself.
You
right?
could, yeah, because it's so quiet. So it's not just about being green. It's actually about making 3D transportation, something that is acceptable and not impeding on, from acoustics and noise and perspective. But it's such an odd feeling where you're, instead of talking in a normal voice, because it's so quiet and because you're expecting the sound of a propeller, motor or a jet engine. So because it's so quiet, it drives you to speak more quietly. So you're literally speaking in a whisper like this. And then that recently, we actually just a few weeks ago, we were at an air show where there were thousands of people, and you couldn't hear the airplane over the sound of the people. Wow. And it's flying like just right over the crowd. And I think the announcer said something like, I call that the sound of silence. And it was just like, now the rest of the world, I think, is beginning to get an idea of, it's not just green energy. It's not just low carbon. It's not just decongesting, because at the end of the day, you just can't build more and more roads to deal with the, dense urban communities. It's not just being able to connect people across like L.A. or San Francisco or New York, where it takes literally an hour or 2 hours to go 10 miles, 15 miles. And so people just don't go. And to dig, to forget about the carbon cost of this, but just the billions of dollars it would take to dig underground subways, and still doesn't solve the last quarter mile, the last
Sure.
stack problem.
Sure.
It's really, really neat. But it's not just a cool vision and cool tech. I think one of the things for me that's been really neat about kind of getting to where I am in my life and my career is I get some choice over the people I work with.
Yeah.
And the people I get to work with at Archer are incredible people. And we've pulled OGs from all sorts of different places, from NASA and places like the Apples and the Googles of the world, and the Bloom Energies of the world, and the Teslas of the world. So it's about bringing actually multi-generational talent and a broad spectrum of technical talent, and not just technical, but also marketing and policy and regulatory, because to change transportation, it's not just a technology problem. It's as much a regulatory problem and infrastructure problem. How are we going to live in a society that has three-dimensional transportation in a much bigger way than we have today? Like if you look at air traffic control, that technology today is roughly 50 years old.
Wow.
So imagine if you had a 50-year-old computer, right?
It wouldn't probably work
Well,
that well.
Yeah, it would do some very limited things.
Yeah.
Alessandro, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for coming. I really enjoyed our conversation. And if you like this episode, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, we'd love to hear from you. What was a failure in your life that inspired a success later? Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, stay tuned.